If you have a passion for languages, but you're learning mostly one at a time and you're wondering how to learn two at once, stay and watch the whole video because I'm going to break down all of these strategies and tips that you need in order to be successful doing so. Plus, I'll share exactly how I am learning both Russian and Portuguese at the same time. I first advise you to have different levels in them, especially if they are coming from a similar language learning family. I would usually keep the gap between an A0 language and an A2/B1 language at a minimum. Especially with a full-time job and other obligations where I couldn't just study languages all day, being able to have the gap and work on one before adding on another one in the future really helped me learning even Spanish and Italian. You know, you can start from A0 with very similar languages, but only if you have a strong background in previous languages that are really similar to the ones that you want to start. So if I wanted to, I'm actually learning Portuguese this year, and I could probably also start it with Romanian, which yes is more of a Slavic language, but it also has a lot of Romance language roots. The only time in the world that I would suggest you to start two very different, maybe even harder languages that aren't very close to your native language English, where you don't have any background at all, is if you have like all the time in the world, maybe you're a college student. I studied two languages at the same time that were very different from my native language from A0, but that was only because I had the luxury of time and energy to put into that. And that is just not realistic for the most of us with full obligations outside of learning. I also recommend one base resource for each of the two languages you're going to study. So one base resource is going to be more intensely focused. That encompasses a lot of the main skills you want to work on, such as reading, writing, listening, speaking, vocabulary, and grammar. So that could look like a textbook or a sort of like self-study program. That's the one that I will be doing for Russian. And then for the other base resource, for my Portuguese one, where I am a complete beginner in, I'm going to use a more laid back base resource, which for me, that means either just sticking to one podcast or one YouTube channel, because I usually feel like anything that is heavily input instead of output, like writing and speaking, I feel like that is going to be helpful for me in balancing out my energy. You could even use an app for your base resource. And what I usually like to do is use either Mango Languages. They have a lot of languages anyways for beginners, and or Pimsleur, which is a great audio only app too, that again lets me use less energy, because I know I'm going to be using a lot more energy on the more intense base resource for my more advanced language. So I kind of like to balance out the energy that I expend between the two, and that's going to depend on what base resource I'm going to choose for each. Another thing I really suggest you doing, because I know we can get really overwhelmed with resources, is keep your resources to a maximum of 3 at a very beginner level, or maximum 5 to 6 for the more advanced language you're studying at the same time. I won't run into as much decision fatigue, and it keeps me really focused on what resource I'm actually trying to finish. Go into learning two languages at once with the knowledge that you will naturally prioritize one over the other, usually at any given time, right? Because prioritizing both, especially when we have a lot of obligations outside of learning, can be very hard. We can put a lot of unnecessary pressure on ourselves to do so. So that's always why I recommend, having a more relaxed, takes less energy from you resource for one of your languages, and then a more intensely focused base resource for your more advanced language. So you can really balance out your energy. I also like to make sure that I do the language that takes more energy from me during the part of my day where I have the highest energy, which for me is usually in the morning. And then when I have lower energy, maybe in the evening, that is when I usually work on my second language that requires less output from me and less energy too. By the way, I love hosting deep dive workshops on everything and anything that helps you master your language. If you are a solo language learner with ambitious goals, I invite you to go to the comments below and get on the wait list, because I'm gonna have a lot of awesome workshops being hosted both live and pre-recorded in the coming months, so stay tuned. Also, make sure you give a like and subscribe if you are finding this video helpful so far. Okay, so what does my schedule look like for actually studying two languages at once? I first start with maybe anywhere between 1 to 2 hours in the highest energy point of my day in the mornings with the language whose base resource is going to be more intensely focused. So for me, that's going to look like dedicating these 1 to 2 hours in the mornings to Russian with my kind of all-inclusive program of Red Kalinka from the levels A1 up until B1. I also, if I have time within that 1 to 2 hours, not only focus on, getting the main, listening, reading, and grammar, vocabulary skills from that base resource program, but I also add in maybe some writing anywhere from 1 to 2 times per week if I still have time in my high energy mornings. And that really involves something really light if I don't have a lot of energy after my initial session, maybe even writing 1 to up to 5 sentences in Russian and just saying what I learned, being able to use really any of the vocabulary, the new grammar. And I love to write this by hand because it really solidifies new neural connections in my brain, making sure that I grow an intuitive use of the language and its structure and vocabulary. I also love to create my personal vocabulary list on the side. If you are wondering what that even is, do check out this video above in the card so you can see how I like to divide my notebook up, especially to prioritize what words I need to know when. And even though I make this personal vocabulary list during, those 1 or 2 high energy hours, I definitely add like active study time of vocabulary, maybe about 15 minutes after those 1 or 2 hours, if I have more energy just to swipe through my flashcards on Quizlet or memorize anything like that. And at this point, depending on if I am very high energy still, I will make myself actively recall the word, right? So I will have the Russian word on one end of the flashcard. I'll have the English translation on the back, and then I will make myself look first at the English translation so that I can actively recall the Russian. Now that is more cognitively demanding than just looking at the Russian word and having to remember, hey, what does that mean in English, right? But I would choose the latter if I were on a lower energy day. What you could also do if you are learning 2 languages at the same time, but one language is anywhere from a B1 and higher, you can actually language stack between the 2 languages that you're learning. So say that I was already like a B1 in Russian and I was trying to learn Portuguese, I would be able to learn my entirely new vocabulary from Portuguese and think about what it meant in Russian instead of my native language, English, right? You're just essentially using your stronger language to recall your weaker one. I'm not going to be doing that with Russian and Portuguese in reality because my level is just not there yet in either. And any sort of leisure time that I do outside of my high energy sort of mornings for Russian, I love to either listen to Russian music or listen even more to a podcast, right? That's offered outside of the sort of like base program that I'm already using for understanding the nuances of the language. That can be anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, but I don't really measure the time. It's just whenever I feel like it. I will also usually on the weekends have a max 30-minute conversation class in Russian. And again, just like I do with writing, that is really to solidify the grammar, the vocabulary and sort of structures that I'm learning from my base program and getting another opportunity to simply work with output in the language. Plus, I might devote a few extra minutes, anywhere from 5 to 15, to add to my flashcards or my personal vocab list, whatever I learned in the conversation class that day. I have explained my high energy, sort of more advanced language with the more intense base resource. Let's now move on to my beginner from zero language, Portuguese, that I am going to learn in a lower energy way. What I do with Portuguese is I focus on it in the evenings when I am low energy. I'm going to use either an app or a podcast only, doing anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how low my energy still is. And I will do max 1 to 2 lessons from the app and or from the podcast that I'm listening to. And because these apps, like Mango Languages, usually come with a flashcard deck built in for you, I won't usually dedicate more time to making flashcards or making a personal vocab list yet, just because I'm really building a base in the language itself. And same thing with a podcast. Usually they are going to have either the transcript or they're going to have key vocabulary words or different expressions that are good to note away from the podcast episode. So I'll mostly just look through that instead of making anything outside of it. And through repetition, through exposure, I gather and intuit more vocabulary from Portuguese at a slower pace perhaps than my more intensive active language, which is Russian, but still at a steady pace that works for me and my energy, right? You don't have to learn fast, quote unquote, for anything that you do for your languages to count. And every few months, I will go back and reevaluate, do I want to take more of a low energy approach with Russian? Do I want to increase the intensity on my Portuguese? I can't do both, so what dials am I going to dial up and then scroll back down for right now? Usually naturally throughout the year, I'll just fluctuate between the two in terms of intensity and what language I focus on more. And I really want to emphasize how important it is to keep flexibility as a priority when you are learning two languages at once, right? Because you have a lot of things going on in your life, I am sure. Our well-being as a language learner matters, right? We don't want to keep on raising the stakes so high and our expectations so high, especially when we're learning two languages at once now instead of one, right? It can get really overwhelming if we're not careful. So that is why flexibility is the best thing that we could be able to do. Again, with what I just talked about, with being able to dial up and dial down the intensity of the harder language versus the quote unquote easier language, or the language we have more knowledge in versus the language we have no knowledge in, right? And you're going to give yourself, again, space to be able to experiment with that over time. I love to have at least one day of the week that I tell myself, you don't have to do anything with language learning today if you don't want to. That doesn't mean I definitely don't, but it gives me the possibility of being able to rest if I really need to, because strategic rest and strategic breaks are different than just being lazy and unproductive in your learning, right? There is a definite balance in understanding for yourself, right? When is it strategic to actually rest my brain for a little bit so that it can absorb and perform at its best whenever we go back into an intensive, active period of studying our two languages? By enforcing this boundary on myself with this one day out of the week, it really helps me feel more at peace with my language learning in the long term, especially if we are here learning and trying to maintain multiple languages at once. Let me know in the comments if you have any more questions or what really stood out. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next video soon.